I sat frozen in that leather chair, watching 12 faces around the mahogany table stare at me with barely concealed contempt. "Marcus, your incompetence has cost us enough," CEO Richard Blackwood declared, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "We're voting you out of your position effective immediately." The papers scattered across the table told the story they wanted to believe. Fabricated reports, twisted metrics, and carefully orchestrated lies designed to destroy everything I'd built over 15 years. But what none of them knew was that our biggest client was walking through those doors in exactly 10 minutes, and they were about to learn the truth about who really ran this company. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my face steady. These weren't just colleagues anymore. They were executioners dressed in expensive suits, ready to end my career with a simple majority vote. I thought about my wife Sarah waiting at home, about our mortgage payments, about the promises I'd made to our teenage daughter about her college fund. Everything was about to crumble because of their greed and my refusal to compromise my principles. But sometimes the universe has a way of delivering justice when you least expect it. 3 months earlier, life seemed predictable at Meridian Financial Group. I walked into the office each morning at 7 sharp, coffee in hand, ready to tackle another day of managing our institutional clients. As senior portfolio manager, I oversaw nearly $2 billion in assets, maintained relationships with our most demanding clients, and somehow kept our volatile CEO Richard Blackwood from making decisions that would sink the entire firm. Richard was everything I wasn't: flashy, aggressive, and completely willing to cut corners if it meant bigger profits. He'd inherited the company from his father 5 years ago and immediately began reshaping it in his own image. Where the elder Blackwood had built relationships on trust and steady returns, Richard chased quick wins and risky investments that looked impressive in quarterly reports, but terrified anyone who understood long-term consequences. The tension between us had been building for months. It started with small disagreements during strategy meetings. Richard would propose some elaborate scheme involving derivatives or cryptocurrency investments, and I'd quietly point out the regulatory risks or potential client backlash. He'd brush off my concerns with that condescending smile he'd perfected, the one that said he tolerated my caution because his father had specifically requested I stay on during the transition. "Marcus thinks like an old man," he'd joke to the other executives loud enough for me to hear. "Sometimes you have to take risks to make real money." The irony wasn't lost on me. At 45, I was hardly ancient, but in Richard's world of aggressive trading and speculative investments, my preference for stability and ethical practices marked me as a relic from a bygone era. The younger portfolio managers laughed along, with his jokes, eager to curry favor with the boss who controlled their bonuses and career advancement. But our clients told a different story. Month after month, my portfolios outperformed the firm average. My client retention rate was 96% compared to the company average of 78%. When market volatility sent other managers scrambling to explain losses, my clients called to thank me for keeping their assets safe. I'd built these relationships over 15 years, through bear markets and bull runs, through economic crashes and recoveries. My biggest success story was Grandview Industries, a manufacturing conglomerate run by Elizabeth Chen, a brilliant woman in her 60s who'd built her company from a small family business into a billion-dollar operation. Elizabeth was everything Richard pretended to be: sharp, decisive, and completely intolerant of incompetence. She'd moved her company's entire pension fund to Meridian specifically to work with me, after her previous firm had nearly lost 30% of their assets in a series of reckless trades. "I don't care about flashy returns," Elizabeth had told me during our first meeting 3 years ago. "I care about my employees' retirement security. Can you deliver that?" I could, and I did. Under my management, Grandview's pension fund had grown by 42% while maintaining the conservative risk profile she'd requested. Elizabeth became not just a client, but a trusted advisor, someone whose business acumen I respected enormously. She had a way of cutting through corporate nonsense to focus on what really mattered: results, integrity, and long-term thinking, which made Richard's growing hostility toward her all the more puzzling. During client meetings, he'd interrupt her questions with dismissive comments about old-school thinking or missing opportunities for growth. Elizabeth would listen politely, then turn to me with raised eyebrows that said everything about what she thought of our CEO's attitude. "Your boss seems to think pension funds should behave like hedge funds," she observed after one particularly uncomfortable meeting. "That's a dangerous philosophy for someone managing other people's retirement security." I agreed, but loyalty to the firm kept me from saying so directly. Instead, I focused on delivering the steady, reliable service that had built my reputation. I arrived early, stayed late, and spent weekends reviewing market analysis to ensure my clients' portfolios remained optimized. My personal life suffered. Sarah and I barely saw each other except on weekends, and our daughter Emma had stopped asking me to attend her school events because she assumed I'd be too busy. The sacrifice felt worthwhile when I looked at the results. My division generated 38% of Meridian's total revenue, despite representing only 22% of our assets under management. The math was simple. Quality clients who trusted their portfolio manager generated more business, more referrals, and more long-term stability than the flashy day trading accounts Richard preferred to chase. But Richard saw those numbers differently. During our quarterly review meetings, he'd fixate on the size of individual trades rather than overall performance. He wanted to see million-dollar swings, dramatic gains that would impress potential investors and justify his aggressive compensation package. My steady 6 to 8% annual returns looked boring compared to the 30% spikes some of his preferred managers achieved. Never mind that those same managers often gave back their gains within 6 months. The breaking point came during a particularly contentious executive meeting in early September. Richard had proposed moving Grandview's pension fund into a series of high-risk cryptocurrency investments, claiming the potential returns would revolutionize their retirement planning. The other executives nodded along enthusiastically, already calculating their bonuses from the increased fee structure such investments would generate. I couldn't stay silent. Elizabeth Chen specifically requested conservative investments, I said, keeping my voice level despite the frustration building in my chest. Moving her employees' pension fund into cryptocurrency would violate both her explicit instructions and our fiduciary responsibility. Richard's face flushed red. "Elizabeth Chen doesn't run this company, Marcus. I do, and I'm telling you that pension fund is underperforming its potential." "It's performing exactly as she requested," I replied. "Steady growth with minimal risk. That's why she chose us over firms that lost millions chasing speculative investments." "Maybe she chose the wrong firm," Richard snapped. "Maybe she needs to work with people who understand modern portfolio management instead of hiding behind outdated strategies." The room fell silent. Even the other executives seemed uncomfortable with the implication that our biggest client might be better served elsewhere. I stared at Richard, realizing this wasn't really about investment strategies or portfolio performance. This was about control, about proving he could override anyone who questioned his authority. "Elizabeth Chen's account generates more revenue than any 3 other clients combined," I said quietly. "Suggesting she might be happier elsewhere seems counterproductive." Richard's smile turned predatory. "Revenue isn't everything, Marcus. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions about who fits the company culture and who doesn't." I should have seen the warning signs more clearly. Over the following weeks, Richard began excluding me from meetings I'd previously attended as a matter of course. Client communications that had once come directly to me were now routed through his office first. Most concerning, I noticed discrepancies in the reports being generated about my division's performance, numbers that didn't match my own records, metrics that seemed designed to minimize my contributions while highlighting areas where improvement might be needed. When I raised these concerns with HR, Department Head Jennifer Walsh listened politely before explaining that all reporting procedures were being standardized across the firm. She assured me the changes weren't personal, just part of Richard's broader efficiency initiative. But her eyes wouldn't meet mine, and she seemed eager to end our conversation as quickly as possible. The manipulation became more obvious as October progressed. Suddenly, clients were being assigned to other portfolio managers without my input. New account acquisition bonuses I'd earned were being attributed to team efforts rather than individual performance. Most frustrating, Elizabeth Chen was being scheduled for meetings that conflicted with my calendar, forcing other managers to handle communications with our most important client. I tried to address these issues directly with Richard, requesting a private meeting to discuss what felt like a systematic effort to undermine my position. He agreed to meet, but his assistant scheduled it for a Friday afternoon when most of the executive team would be present, hardly the private conversation I'd requested. "Marcus, I'm glad you brought up these concerns," Richard said, gesturing toward the conference room filled with my colleagues. "We've all been discussing some performance issues in your division, and this gives us a chance to address them directly." My stomach dropped. This wasn't a meeting. It was an ambush. Richard had prepared a presentation outlining supposed problems with my client management approach, complete with carefully selected data points that painted my conservative investment strategy as a liability rather than an asset. He highlighted the few clients who'd left over the past year while ignoring the dozens who'd stayed and prospered. He showed projected returns from more aggressive investment strategies without mentioning the associated risks. "The financial services industry is evolving rapidly," Richard explained to the room, though his eyes remained fixed on me. "Clients expect dynamic growth, innovative solutions, and cutting-edge strategies. Unfortunately, some of our managers seem more comfortable with approaches that might have worked 20 years ago, but don't meet today's expectations." I listened to him systematically dismantle my reputation, using half-truths and misleading statistics to suggest I was holding the firm back. The other executives nodded along, some looking genuinely convinced, others simply eager to avoid becoming Richard's next target. When he finally asked if I had any response, I realized the outcome had been predetermined long before I'd walked into the room. "Our clients choose us based on results," I said simply. "My division has consistently outperformed firm averages while maintaining the risk profiles our clients specifically requested. I'm not sure what problem we're trying to solve here." Richard smiled that condescending smile. "The problem, Marcus, is that you're not seeing the bigger picture. This industry rewards innovation and growth, not playing it safe with other people's money." The meeting ended with vague promises to revisit these concerns and develop strategies for improvement. But I knew what I'd just witnessed. Richard had spent weeks building a case for my removal, and today had been the opening argument. The trial would continue until he'd gathered enough support from the board to make his move. I drove home that night, feeling hollow inside. Sarah took one look at my face and knew something was seriously wrong. Over dinner, I explained what had happened, watching her expression shift from confusion to anger to the kind of quiet determination that had helped us weather every previous crisis in our 15-year marriage. "They're trying to steal your job," she said bluntly. "After everything you've built there, after all the money you've made them, they want to push you out so they can take credit for your work." She was right, but knowing it didn't make the situation any easier to navigate. Fighting back would require resources I wasn't sure I possessed, political capital I'd never bothered to accumulate, relationships with board members I'd rarely interacted with, evidence of wrongdoing that would be difficult to prove. Richard had been planning this campaign for months, while I'd been focused on managing portfolios and serving clients. But giving up wasn't an option either. This job wasn't just a paycheck. It was my identity, my contribution to something larger than myself. More importantly, it was the foundation of the life Sarah and I had built together, the security that would pay for Emma's college education and our eventual retirement. I couldn't let Richard destroy all of that because he needed a scapegoat for his own inadequacies. The final piece of Richard's plan became clear the following Monday morning. I arrived at the office to find a message from Elizabeth Chen's assistant requesting an emergency meeting to discuss concerning developments with Grandview's account. My blood went cold as I read the details. Someone had initiated unauthorized trades over the weekend, moving significant portions of her pension fund into exactly the kind of high-risk investments she'd explicitly prohibited. I called Elizabeth immediately, but her assistant explained she was already en route to our office for an unscheduled meeting with senior management. The trades had been executed using my authorization codes, though I'd been home with my family all weekend and had no knowledge of any transactions. Someone had deliberately used my access to sabotage the relationship with our most important client, knowing Elizabeth would demand accountability for what appeared to be a direct violation of her trust. This was it, the final move in Richard's chess game. He'd created a crisis that would justify my immediate termination while positioning himself as the responsible leader cleaning up my mess. The other executives would see unauthorized trades as grounds for dismissal, regardless of my protestations of innocence. Elizabeth would be furious about the breach of her explicit instructions, and her anger would provide cover for whatever disciplinary action Richard chose to take. I sat in my office, staring at the trading records that would destroy my career, and realized I was about to lose everything I'd worked 15 years to build. Richard had outmaneuvered me completely, using my own reputation for integrity against me by making it appear I'd betrayed the trust of my most valued client. But as I prepared for what would likely be my final day at Meridian Financial Group, I remembered something Elizabeth had told me during one of our strategy sessions. In business, Marcus, the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. People who build their success on lies always get exposed, usually when they least expect it. I hoped she was right, because in a few hours, I'd be walking into a boardroom where 12 people would decide my fate based on carefully constructed deceptions. The only question was whether the truth would surface in time to save my career, or whether Richard's lies had already won the day. The elevator ride to the executive boardroom felt like ascending to my own execution. Each floor that passed brought me closer to facing 12 board members who'd already made up their minds based on Richard's carefully orchestrated lies. My hands trembled slightly as I clutched the folder containing my own evidence, the real trading records, client testimonials, and performance data that told the true story of my 15 years at Meridian Financial Group. But would anyone listen? Or had Richard's poisonous narrative already taken root too deeply for facts to matter? As the elevator doors opened, I saw Jennifer Walsh from HR waiting in the hallway, her face a mask of professional sympathy that barely concealed her discomfort. She'd been part of this conspiracy from the beginning, I realized now. Every time I'd raised concerns about the changing reporting procedures, every question I'd asked about my excluded meetings, she'd been feeding information back to Richard while pretending to advocate for my interests. "Marcus," she said, her voice artificially gentle, "I want you to know this isn't personal. The board simply feels it's time for new leadership in your division." New leadership. The euphemism struck me as particularly cruel. They weren't just firing me. They were erasing my contribution entirely, rewriting history to suggest my departure was part of some natural evolution rather than a calculated assassination. "Where's Elizabeth Chen?" I asked, ignoring her attempt at consolation. She was supposed to be in a meeting about her account. Jennifer's pause lasted a fraction too long. "Ms. Chen's meeting has been rescheduled. Today's agenda focuses on internal restructuring." Another lie. They'd deliberately kept Elizabeth away because her presence would complicate their narrative. She knew the truth about those unauthorized trades, knew I'd never violate her trust in such a blatant manner. Richard couldn't risk having her defend me when he needed the board to see me as a liability rather than an asset. The boardroom doors loomed ahead like the entrance to a coliseum. Inside, 12 people who controlled my professional destiny waited around that imposing mahogany table. I'd sat in this room countless times over the years, presenting quarterly reports, discussing client strategies, celebrating successful campaigns. Today, I'd be fighting for my career against accusations I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. Richard stood at the head of the table as I entered, looking every inch the confident CEO in his tailored navy suit and silk tie. His presentation materials were already arranged with military precision, charts, graphs, and documents that would paint me as incompetent, reckless, and unfit for continued employment. The other board members barely glanced up as I took my seat, their body language suggesting this was merely a formality before reaching their predetermined conclusion. Board Chairman William Sterling, a distinguished man in his 70s who'd known Richard's father for decades, called the meeting to order with the solemnity of a funeral director. "We're here to address serious concerns about portfolio management, practices in Marcus Rivera's division," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. Richard began his presentation with the confidence of a prosecutor delivering his closing argument. He displayed charts showing my division's underperformance compared to industry benchmarks, carefully omitting the risk-adjusted returns that told a completely different story. He highlighted client departures without mentioning the retention rates that exceeded company averages. Most damaging, he presented the unauthorized trades as evidence of my increasingly erratic decision-making and flagrant disregard for client instructions. Grandview Industries specifically requested conservative investment strategies, Richard explained to the board, his voice heavy with manufactured disappointment. Yet Marcus chose to ignore those instructions, moving their pension fund into high-risk cryptocurrency investments without authorization. This represents not just poor judgment, but a fundamental breach of fiduciary responsibility. I watched the board members' faces as they absorbed this information. Some looked genuinely shocked, others merely confirmed in their existing suspicions. Margaret Winters, the board's risk management specialist, took notes furiously, already calculating the potential liability exposure from Elizabeth's inevitable lawsuit. David Park, our longest-serving board member, stared at the documents with the kind of grim resignation that suggested he'd seen this story before. Furthermore, Richard continued, multiple clients have expressed concerns about outdated investment approaches and resistance to innovative strategies. Marcus seems unwilling or unable to adapt to the evolving needs of today's sophisticated investors. Each accusation felt like a physical blow, made worse by the kernel of twisted truth at its center. I had resisted some of Richard's more aggressive proposals, but only because they violated the specific risk parameters our clients had established. I had maintained conservative investment approaches, but only because they consistently delivered the steady returns our clients valued above speculative gains. Everything positive about my performance had been reframed as evidence of failure. When Richard finished his presentation, Chairman Sterling turned to me with the kind of paternal disappointment that cut deeper than outright hostility. "Marcus, these are very serious allegations. What's your response to these concerns?" This was my moment, perhaps my only chance to present the truth before they voted to end my career. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, and looked around the table at faces that had once greeted me with respect and collegiality. Now they watched me with the detached curiosity of scientists observing a failed experiment. "Everything you've just heard is a deliberate distortion of the facts," I began, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "Those trading records don't tell. The complete story and the client complaints Richard mentioned don't reflect the overwhelming satisfaction ratings my division has maintained for over a decade." I opened my folder and began distributing copies of the real performance data, the numbers Richard's presentation had carefully avoided. My division has generated 38% of Meridian's total revenue over the past 3 years, while managing only 22% of our assets under management. Our client retention rate exceeds 96%, compared to the firm average of 78%. These aren't the metrics of underperformance. Margaret Winters looked up from the documents I'd provided, her expression shifting slightly, as she compared them to Richard's presentation materials. "These numbers don't match what we just saw," she observed, a note of confusion in her voice. "Because Richard's presentation used selective data to support a predetermined narrative," I replied, feeling a surge of hope as at least one board member began questioning the official story. "The unauthorized trades on Grandview's account weren't executed by me. I was home with my family all weekend and I have cell phone records, credit card receipts, and witness testimony to prove it." Richard's face darkened. "That's a very serious accusation, Marcus. Are you suggesting someone else used your authorization codes?" "I'm not suggesting it. I'm stating it as fact. Someone with administrative access to our trading system executed those transactions using my credentials, knowing Elizabeth Chen would demand accountability for what appeared to be a violation of her explicit instructions." The room fell silent, as the implications of this accusation settled over the board members. If I was telling the truth, then someone at Meridian had deliberately sabotaged a client relationship to frame me for misconduct. If I was lying, then I was compounding my alleged trading violations with false accusations against my colleagues. David Park leaned forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "Marcus, you're alleging a conspiracy within our own firm. That's an extraordinary claim that would require extraordinary evidence." He was right, and I knew it. The evidence I possessed, the real trading records, the timeline discrepancies, the suspicious pattern of excluded meetings and altered reports, painted a compelling picture of systematic manipulation. But proving Richard had orchestrated this campaign would require access to internal communications, system logs, and administrative records that I couldn't obtain without the board's authorization. "I understand how this sounds," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But consider the timeline. Over the past 3 months, I've been systematically excluded from meetings I'd previously attended. My client communications have been rerouted through Richard's office, and my performance reports have been altered to minimize my contributions. This morning's unauthorized trades represent the culmination of a deliberate effort to create grounds for my termination." Richard stood abruptly, his composure finally cracking. "This is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that makes Marcus unsuitable for his position," he declared, his voice rising with indignation. "Rather than accepting responsibility for his mistakes, he's creating elaborate conspiracy theories to deflect blame." But I wasn't finished. Reaching into my folder, I pulled out a series of emails I'd forwarded to my personal account over the past weeks. Communications that showed the systematic pattern of my exclusion from normal business operations. These messages document the changes in my access to client information, meeting invitations, and strategic planning sessions. The pattern is clear and deliberate. Chairman Sterling examined the emails carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each page. "Richard, can you explain why Marcus was excluded from the Grandview strategy meeting last Tuesday? According to our records, he's been their primary relationship manager for 3 years." Richard's pause lasted several seconds too long. We felt it was important to get fresh perspectives on that account. Marcus's approach had become too rigid. "Fresh perspectives on a client relationship that generates $12 million in annual revenue?" Margaret Winters interjected, her risk management instincts clearly activated. "That seems like an unusual decision without documenting the rationale." I seized on this opening. "Elizabeth Chen specifically requested to work with me when she moved Grandview's pension fund to Meridian. She's repeatedly expressed satisfaction with our conservative approach and steady returns." Excluding me from strategy sessions about her account violated the explicit terms of our client agreement. The board members began whispering among themselves, their unified front starting to crack as inconsistencies in Richard's narrative became apparent. I could see doubt creeping into their expressions, the kind of uncertainty that came from realizing they might not have the complete story. Richard sensed the shift in momentum and moved to regain control. "Even if we set aside the specific trading incident," he said, his voice carefully modulated to project reasoned authority, "the fundamental issue remains unchanged. Marcus's investment philosophy is out of step with current market realities. Our clients expect dynamic growth strategies, not the conservative approaches that might have worked in previous decades." This was the heart of our philosophical disagreement, the core conflict that had been building for months. Richard genuinely believed that aggressive trading and speculative investments represented the future of financial services, while I maintained that fiduciary responsibility required prioritizing client security over flashy returns. The board would ultimately have to choose between these competing visions for Meridian's future. "Richard's referring to a fundamental difference in our approach to client service," I said, addressing the board directly. "He believes we should maximize returns through high-risk investments, regardless of client preferences. I believe our primary obligation is honoring the specific risk parameters our clients have established, even if that means lower potential returns." David Park nodded thoughtfully. "And what do our clients prefer? Have we surveyed their satisfaction with current portfolio performance?" This question struck at the weakness in Richard's argument. Client satisfaction surveys consistently showed that Meridian's customers valued stability and trust above aggressive growth. The few clients who'd departed over the past year had left for firms promising even more conservative approaches, not the high-risk strategies Richard advocated. "Our most recent client survey showed 91% satisfaction with current portfolio management," I replied, consulting my notes. The complaints Richard mentioned came from 3 clients out of our base of over 200, and 2 of those 3 returned within 6 months after experiencing losses with more aggressive firms. Margaret Winters looked up sharply. "Richard, your presentation suggested widespread client dissatisfaction. Are you saying only 3 clients have formally complained about Marcus's management approach?" Richard's face flushed red. "Client complaints aren't the only metric that matters, Margaret. We need to consider potential business we might be losing to competitors who offer more innovative services." "Potential business isn't the same as actual complaints," she replied firmly. "If we're considering terminating a senior portfolio manager, we need concrete evidence of performance failures, not speculation about hypothetical opportunities." I felt a surge of gratitude toward Margaret, whose risk management background made her naturally suspicious of decisions based on incomplete information. She was asking the questions I'd hoped someone would pose, challenging Richard to provide actual evidence rather than vague assertions about industry trends. But Richard wasn't finished. Reaching into his briefcase, he produced a thick folder I'd never seen before. "Since Marcus has questioned the completeness of our documentation, I'd like the board to review these additional materials. They include detailed analyses of portfolio performance, client feedback surveys, and industry benchmarking studies that support our concerns about his division's direction." My heart sank as I realized Richard had prepared for my defense, anticipating my arguments and developing counter-evidence to neutralize every point I might raise. The folder likely contained more selectively edited data, carefully crafted to support his narrative while avoiding the broader context that would vindicate my approach. Chairman Sterling accepted the folder with obvious reluctance, clearly uncomfortable with the amount of documentation this personnel decision was generating. "Richard, this is highly unusual. Typically, performance reviews are handled through normal HR channels, not presented to the full board with extensive supporting materials." "This situation is highly unusual," Richard replied. "Marcus's resistance to constructive feedback and his accusations of conspiracy within our own firm suggest deeper issues that require board-level attention. The room fell silent again as the board members began reviewing Richard's additional materials. I watched their faces, trying to gauge their reactions to whatever evidence he'd compiled against me. Some looked confused by the competing versions of events. Others appeared frustrated by the complexity of sorting truth from manipulation. As the minutes ticked by, I found myself thinking about Sarah and Emma, about the life we'd built on the foundation of my career at Meridian. Emma was a junior in high school, already researching colleges and planning for a future that depended on my continued employment. Sarah had put her own career aspirations on hold to support my demanding schedule, trusting that the sacrifices would eventually pay off in financial security and professional satisfaction. If Richard succeeded in destroying my reputation, the consequences would extend far beyond this boardroom. Word would spread throughout the financial services industry that I'd been terminated for misconduct, making it nearly impossible to find comparable employment elsewhere. At 45, I'd be starting over in an industry that valued youth and connections above experience and integrity. But more than my own future was at stake. If Richard could orchestrate my removal through lies and manipulation, what would prevent him from targeting other employees who questioned his judgment? The culture of fear and conformity he was creating would ultimately destroy everything the elder Blackwood had built, replacing trust and competence with politics and self-preservation. Margaret Winters finally looked up from the documents, her expression troubled. "I'm seeing significant discrepancies between these reports and the materials Marcus provided. The performance metrics don't align, the client satisfaction data contradicts itself, and the timeline for these alleged policy violations doesn't match our administrative records." Chairman Sterling rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated by the conflicting information. "Richard, can you explain these inconsistencies? We need clear, verifiable facts before making a decision of this magnitude." Richard's confidence wavered for the first time since the meeting began. "Sometimes different analytical approaches produce varying results," he said, his voice less certain than before. "The important thing is the overall pattern of performance, issues, and client concerns." "The important thing is accuracy," Margaret replied firmly. "If we're terminating a 15-year employee based on performance data, that data needs to be completely reliable. What I'm seeing suggests either significant errors in our reporting systems or deliberate manipulation of the facts." My pulse quickened as I realized Margaret was essentially accusing Richard of fabricating evidence. She was risking her own position by challenging the CEO so directly, but her professional integrity wouldn't allow her to participate in what was beginning to look like a systematic deception. David Park joined the questioning. "Richard, I'd like to understand the process you used to compile these performance reports. Did you work with our IT department to ensure the data extraction was properly validated?" Another excellent question that struck at the heart of Richard's methodology. If he'd manipulated the data without proper oversight, the inconsistencies Margaret had identified would be easy to explain. But admitting to such manipulation would destroy his credibility and potentially expose him to legal liability. "Our internal reporting procedures are constantly evolving," Richard replied evasively. "I used the most current methodologies available to ensure we had comprehensive information for this review." Translation. He'd cherry-picked data to support his predetermined conclusion, while ignoring anything that contradicted his narrative. Margaret and David were clearly recognizing the evasiveness in his responses, their expressions becoming more skeptical with each non-answer. I decided to press my advantage. If there's uncertainty about the accuracy of our performance data, I'd suggest requesting an independent audit of my division's results. Any objective analysis would confirm that my portfolios have consistently outperformed firm benchmarks while maintaining the risk profiles our clients specifically requested. Richard's face darkened. An audit would be expensive and time-consuming. The board shouldn't need to commission external reviews to make basic personnel decisions. If the personnel decision involves terminating a senior manager based on disputed performance data, an audit seems like a reasonable precaution, Margaret observed. The cost of verification would be minimal compared to the potential liability if we act on inaccurate information. I could see Richard's strategy beginning to unravel as board members started questioning his evidence and methodology. The unanimous support he'd expected was fragmenting into doubt and skepticism, creating space for the truth to emerge despite his careful manipulation. But I also knew he wouldn't surrender easily. Richard had invested too much political capital in this campaign to accept defeat gracefully. If he couldn't convince the board to terminate me based on fabricated performance issues, he'd likely escalate his attacks, making increasingly desperate accusations until someone stopped him. The confrontation was far from over, but for the first time since entering this boardroom, I felt a glimmer of hope that justice might prevail over deception. The tension in the boardroom was suffocating as Richard's carefully constructed narrative began crumbling under scrutiny. His face had turned an alarming shade of red, and I could see beads of sweat forming at his temples despite the air conditioning. The unanimous support he'd expected from the board was dissolving into skepticism and uncomfortable questions that he clearly hadn't anticipated. That's when the conference room door burst open. Elizabeth Chen strode into the room like a force of nature, her silver hair perfectly styled, her navy business suit immaculate, and her expression absolutely furious. Behind her walked two men in expensive suits carrying briefcases. Lawyers, I realized immediately. The kind of high-powered attorneys who charged $1,000 an hour and specialized in corporate litigation. "I apologize for the interruption," Elizabeth announced, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "But I believe this board is about to make a catastrophic mistake based on deliberately falsified information." Chairman Sterling rose from his seat, clearly flustered by this unexpected intrusion. "Ms. Chen, I'm afraid this is a closed board meeting. We'll need to schedule a separate time to address any concerns about your account." Elizabeth's laugh was sharp and humorless. "My concerns aren't about my account, Mr. Sterling. They're about the systematic fraud being perpetrated by your CEO to destroy the reputation of the only honest portfolio manager in this building." The word fraud hung in the air like a thunderclap. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats while Richard's face went from red to ashen pale. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs as I realized Elizabeth wasn't just here to defend me. She was here to expose the truth about Richard's manipulation. "That's an extremely serious accusation," Richard managed, his voice barely steady. "I think emotions are running high and perhaps—" "Emotions?" Elizabeth interrupted, her voice rising with indignation. "Mr. Blackwood, I've been in business for 40 years. I didn't build a billion-dollar company by letting emotions cloud my judgment. What I have is evidence." She nodded to one of her lawyers, who immediately began distributing documents to each board member. As they read, their expressions shifted from confusion to shock to something approaching horror. "Those are copies of internal communications from your IT department," Elizabeth explained with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Messages that document unauthorized access to Marcus Rivera's trading credentials, executed from Richard Blackwood's personal computer over this past weekend." The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at Elizabeth in amazement, wondering how she'd obtained such detailed technical evidence. Richard looked like he might be sick, his confident facade completely shattered by this unexpected revelation. Margaret Winters was the first to speak, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Richard, these logs show administrative-level access to Marcus's trading account from your personal workstation at 2:47 a.m. on Saturday morning. Can you explain why you were accessing another employee's credentials outside of normal business hours?" Richard's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged. "There must be. These records could be— anyone with administrative access could have." "Could have what?" Elizabeth demanded. "Could have used your personal computer, with your individual login credentials, During hours when the building was locked and secured? Mr. Blackwood, I may be 63 years old, but I'm not senile. David Park looked up from the documents with an expression of utter disgust. Richard, these communications suggest you not only accessed Marcus's trading account without authorization, but that you specifically targeted Grandview's pension fund to create what appears to be a deliberate violation of their investment parameters. Furthermore, Elizabeth continued, clearly enjoying Richard's discomfort, I have security footage from my own building showing the exact moment I received the automated notification about those unauthorized trades. The timestamp corresponds precisely with the IT logs your people were kind enough to provide. Chairman Sterling's face had gone gray as he absorbed the implications. Ms. Chen, how did you obtain internal IT communications from our firm? Elizabeth smiled grimly. When someone moves $400 million of my employees' retirement funds into cryptocurrency investments I explicitly prohibited, I don't wait for explanations. I immediately contacted my legal team and initiated a forensic investigation. Your IT security is apparently even worse than your corporate governance. The second lawyer stepped forward, introducing himself as Jonathan Hayes from Morrison Wells & Associates, a firm I recognized as one of the most prestigious litigation practices in the city. Mr. Sterling, we've uncovered what appears to be a systematic pattern of document falsification, unauthorized system access, and deliberate client deception. Our preliminary investigation suggests grounds for both civil and criminal charges. Richard finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. This is all circumstantial. Anyone could have accessed those systems. The logs don't prove I personally— Actually, they do, Elizabeth interrupted, producing another document from her briefcase. Your building's security system requires keycard access for after-hours entry. These records show your personal keycard was used to enter the building at 2:15 a.m. on Saturday morning, remaining active until 3:23 a.m., coinciding exactly with the unauthorized trading activity. I watched Richard's face cycle through a range of emotions: panic, desperation, calculation, and finally a kind of resigned defeat. He'd been caught completely, his elaborate deception exposed by the very technology he'd used to execute his plan. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. The most pathetic aspect of this entire scheme, she continued, her voice dripping with contempt, is that Richard apparently believed I wouldn't notice when someone violated my explicit investment instructions. I've been managing complex financial arrangements since before he was born. Did he really think I wouldn't immediately investigate unauthorized changes to my employees' pension fund? Margaret Winters looked up from her notes, her expression a mixture of professional concern and personal outrage. Ms. Chen, beyond the immediate trading violations, what other irregularities have you discovered? Where would you like me to start? Elizabeth replied. The falsified performance reports that systematically understated Marcus's contributions? The client satisfaction surveys that were apparently fabricated entirely? The meeting minutes that recorded decisions never actually made? This isn't just incompetence. It's organized fraud designed to destroy an innocent man's career. David Park turned to Richard, his voice heavy with disappointment. Richard, I've known your family for 30 years. Your father was a man of absolute integrity who built this firm on trust and ethical behavior. What you've done here violates everything he stood for. Richard's composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, he burst out, his voice cracking with desperation. The board expects growth, innovation, modern strategies. Marcus represents everything old and conservative about this industry. I was trying to position the firm for the future. By destroying the reputation of your most successful portfolio manager? Elizabeth asked incredulously. By fabricating evidence and stealing client funds? Mr. Blackwood, that's not innovation. That's stupidity. Chairman Sterling had been silent throughout this exchange, clearly struggling to process the magnitude of what they'd discovered. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of institutional authority that had been built over decades. Richard, based on the evidence presented here today, I'm immediately suspending you from all duties pending a full investigation. Security will escort you from the building, and you're prohibited from accessing any company systems or communications until this matter is resolved. Richard looked around the room desperately, searching for any ally who might support him. But the board members who'd been nodding along with his presentation an hour earlier now regarded him with expressions ranging from disgust to pity. His political capital had evaporated the moment Elizabeth walked through that door with evidence of his deception. "This is a mistake," Richard said, his voice hollow with defeat. "Marcus doesn't understand modern portfolio management. He's holding the firm back with outdated strategies that won't compete in today's market." "Outdated strategies?" Elizabeth laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "Marcus has delivered consistent returns while protecting my employees' retirement. Security. Under his management, our pension fund has outperformed every benchmark we established. Meanwhile, your modern strategies nearly cost us $400 million in a single weekend." Jonathan Hayes stepped forward with another set of documents. "Mr. Sterling, we've also discovered evidence suggesting this wasn't Mr. Blackwood's first attempt to manipulate client accounts for personal advantage. Our forensic analysis has identified at least 6 other instances over the past 18 months where client funds were moved without proper authorization." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Board members began talking simultaneously, their voices rising as they grasped the full scope of Richard's misconduct. This wasn't just about my termination. It was about systematic abuse of client trust that could destroy Meridian's reputation and expose them to massive legal liability. Margaret Winters stood abruptly, her face pale with shock. 6 other instances? Richard, are you telling us you've been manipulating client accounts for over a year? Richard's silence was answer enough. He sat slumped in his chair, no longer the confident CEO who'd opened this meeting with such certainty about my incompetence. The transformation was almost pitiable, from corporate executive to exposed fraud in the span of 30 minutes. Chairman Sterling took control of the deteriorating situation. "This meeting is concluded. Richard, you'll surrender your access credentials immediately and report to HR for processing. Legal counsel will be in contact regarding the investigation. Everyone else, please remain available for follow-up questions." But Elizabeth wasn't ready to leave. She turned to me with an expression that mixed sympathy with fierce protectiveness. "Marcus, I owe you an apology. When I first received those trading notifications, I wondered if you'd finally succumbed to the pressure to abandon your principles. I should have known better." I felt emotion welling up in my throat as I realized how close I'd come to losing everything based on Richard's lies. "Elizabeth, you don't owe me anything. You did exactly what you should have done. You investigated suspicious activity and demanded accountability. What I did was trust the evidence over assumptions," she replied firmly. "That's a lesson everyone in this room should remember. When someone consistently delivers results and maintains integrity over 15 years, they deserve the benefit of the doubt when accusations surface." David Park approached us, extending his hand to me with obvious remorse. "Marcus, I apologize for the board's failure to investigate these allegations more thoroughly before scheduling this meeting. We allowed ourselves to be manipulated by someone we trusted, and you nearly paid the price for our negligence." His apology meant more than he could know. These weren't just professional colleagues anymore. They were people who'd been willing to destroy my career based on fabricated evidence. The fact that they recognized their mistake and took responsibility for it suggested there might be hope for rebuilding trust and moving forward. Margaret Winters joined our conversation, her expression serious but no longer hostile. "Marcus, we'll need to conduct a complete review of all portfolio management procedures to ensure nothing like this happens again. Would you be willing to lead that effort?" I nodded, feeling a surge of purpose that had been missing during the darkest moments of this ordeal. I'd be honored to help rebuild confidence in our systems and procedures. Our clients deserve assurance that their investments are managed with complete integrity. Elizabeth smiled for the first time since entering the boardroom. That's exactly the response I'd expect from someone who understands what fiduciary responsibility really means. Mr. Sterling, I hope you realize what a valuable asset Marcus represents for this firm. Chairman Sterling looked genuinely chastened as he responded. Ms. Chen, today has been a wake-up call about the importance of verification over assumption. We nearly made a catastrophic mistake based on information we should have questioned more rigorously. As security arrived to escort Richard from the building, he paused at the conference room door and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It might have been remorse, or perhaps just the desperate calculation of someone still looking for an angle to exploit. Marcus, he said quietly, this industry is changing whether you adapt or not. Traditional approaches won't survive much longer. Elizabeth's response was swift and cutting. Mr. Blackwood, fraud isn't adaptation, it's desperation. The industry will always need people who prioritize client welfare over personal advancement. That's not traditional thinking. That's timeless principle. After Richard disappeared down the hallway flanked by security guards, the boardroom felt lighter somehow, as if a toxic presence had been removed from the air itself. Board members began discussing next steps: interim leadership, client communications, regulatory notifications, and the comprehensive investigation that would be needed to assess the full extent of the damage. Jonathan Hayes approached me with a business card and a reassuring smile. Marcus, Ms. Chen has asked us to represent your interests during the investigation process. There may be grounds for a defamation lawsuit given the systematic effort to damage your reputation. I accepted the card gratefully, though part of me hoped litigation wouldn't be necessary. I appreciate the offer, but mostly I just want to get back to serving my clients and rebuilding trust in this institution. That's admirable, he replied, but accountability matters too. What happened here today could have destroyed your career and devastated your family's financial security. There should be consequences for that level of professional misconduct. Elizabeth nodded emphatically. Marcus, your forgiveness is commendable, but Richard's actions affected more than just you. Every client who trusted Meridian deserves assurance that this behavior won't be tolerated or repeated. As the formal meeting concluded and people began filing out of the boardroom, I found myself alone with Elizabeth for a few moments. The woman who'd saved my career looked tired but satisfied, like a general who'd won a difficult battle through superior preparation and strategic thinking. How did you know? I asked. How did you know to investigate so thoroughly when those trading notifications first appeared? Elizabeth's smile was knowing and slightly sad. Marcus, I've been in business long enough to recognize when someone is trying to manipulate me. The trades themselves were suspicious enough. They violated everything we'd discussed about risk management. But the timing was what really caught my attention. The timing? Think about it, she said. Unauthorized trades executed over a weekend, discovered on a Monday morning, with a board meeting already scheduled to discuss your performance? That's not coincidence. That's orchestration. Someone wanted those trades discovered at exactly the right moment to maximum damage. Her analysis was brilliant in its simplicity. Richard had been so focused on creating evidence of my misconduct that he'd overlooked the obvious questions his timing would raise. A truly unauthorized trade would have been discovered and reported immediately, not conveniently timed to coincide with a predetermined board meeting. There's something else, Elizabeth continued. Over the past 3 months, I'd noticed subtle changes in our communication patterns. Meetings being rescheduled, reports being delayed, information that usually came directly from you being filtered through other channels. It felt like someone was trying to create distance between us. She'd been more observant than I'd realized, picking up on the systematic exclusion that I'd attributed to routine administrative changes. Her business instincts had detected the manipulation even before the obvious fraud became apparent. As we walked toward the elevator together, Elizabeth placed a hand on my shoulder with genuine warmth. "Marcus, I want you to know that Grandview Industries has complete confidence in your integrity and professional judgment. Whatever happens with the investigation, you'll continue managing our pension fund." Her words meant everything to me. Beyond the vindication and professional validation, Elizabeth was offering the kind of unwavering support that would be crucial during the difficult months ahead. Rebuilding trust and reputation would take time, but having her advocacy would make the process significantly easier. The elevator arrived, and as we descended toward the lobby, I reflected on how dramatically the day had changed. I'd entered this building expecting to be terminated in disgrace, my career destroyed by fabricated accusations and systematic deception. Instead, I was leaving as a vindicated professional whose integrity had been publicly affirmed by one of the most respected business leaders in the city. But the victory felt hollow somehow, tainted by the knowledge of how close I'd come to losing everything based on lies and manipulation. The system had worked eventually, but only because Elizabeth had possessed the resources and determination to conduct her own investigation. Without her intervention, Richard's deception would likely have succeeded. As we reached the lobby, Elizabeth paused before heading to her waiting car. "Marcus, there's one more thing I want you to remember from today. You didn't save yourself by compromising your principles or playing political games. You were vindicated, because you maintained your integrity even when it seemed like the whole world was against you." Her words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, the perspective of someone who'd navigated decades of business challenges without sacrificing her core values. In a world that often rewarded expedience over ethics, she represented proof that principled leadership could still prevail. "Thank you," I said simply, knowing that no words could adequately express my gratitude for her intervention. "You saved more than just my career today." Elizabeth smiled as she walked toward the exit. "I didn't save anything, Marcus. I just made sure the truth had a chance to surface. That's what real leaders do. They create space for integrity, to triumph over deception." As I watched her leave, I realized that this experience had fundamentally changed my understanding of professional relationships and corporate responsibility. The betrayal I'd experienced was devastating, but it had also revealed the character of people around me, showing who could be trusted when stakes were highest and who would sacrifice others to protect their own interests. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Meridian worked to rebuild trust and reputation following Richard's exposure. There would be difficult conversations with clients, regulatory investigations, and the complex process of establishing new leadership. But for the first time in months, I felt confident about the future and my role in shaping it. The truth had finally surfaced, just as Elizabeth had predicted it would. And sometimes, that's all the justice a person really needs. The drive home felt surreal, like emerging from a nightmare into brilliant daylight. My hands were still trembling, slightly as I gripped the steering wheel, processing the magnitude of what had just transpired. 6 hours ago, I'd been facing the destruction of everything I'd worked 15 years to build. Now I was driving home as the newly appointed chief investment officer of Meridian Financial Group, tasked with rebuilding the very institution that had nearly destroyed me. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard's attempt to eliminate me had backfired so spectacularly that I'd been elevated to a position of unprecedented authority within the firm. The board hadn't just vindicated me, they'd essentially handed me the keys to reshape Meridian's entire investment philosophy according to principles I'd advocated for years. As I pulled into our driveway, I saw Sarah and Emma waiting on the front porch, their faces etched with the kind of worry that comes from not knowing whether your world is about to collapse. I'd texted them briefly after the meeting, saying only that everything had worked out. but I could see they needed to hear the full story before they'd truly believe it. Emma ran toward the car before I'd even turned off the engine, her 17-year-old composure cracking as she threw her arms around me. "Dad, I was so scared," she whispered against my shoulder. "Mom told me what was happening and I thought—" "I know, sweetheart," I said, holding her tight. "I was scared too. But sometimes when people try to tear you down, they end up revealing their own weaknesses instead." Sarah approached more cautiously, her lawyer's training making her naturally skeptical of sudden reversals. "Marcus, what exactly happened in that boardroom? Your text was pretty vague." I spent the next hour recounting the day's events, watching their expressions shift from disbelief to amazement to something approaching awe. When I reached the part about Elizabeth's dramatic entrance with evidence of Richard's fraud, Emma actually gasped out loud. "She's like a real-life superhero," Emma said, her eyes wide with admiration. "She just walked in and destroyed the bad guy with facts." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying months of accumulated tension finally being released. "Your father's client is quite remarkable, but Marcus, this means you're essentially running the entire investment division now. That's an enormous responsibility." She was right, and the weight of it was already settling on my shoulders. Meridian managed over $8 billion in client assets, employed nearly 200 investment professionals, and served thousands of families who depended on us for their financial security. The culture of fear and manipulation Richard had created would take time to heal, and rebuilding trust would require more than just exposing past wrongdoing. But I'd been thinking about this challenge during the drive home, and I already had ideas about how to proceed. The first step would be complete transparency. No more hidden agendas, no more selective reporting, no more political maneuvering that put personal advancement above client welfare. Every decision would be made in the open, with clear rationale and measurable outcomes. "The opportunity excites me more than the responsibility scares me," I told Sarah honestly. "For years, I've watched this industry prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. Now I have a chance to prove that ethical practices actually produce better results." That evening, as we sat around the dinner table sharing the first relaxed meal we'd had in months, I found myself reflecting on the lessons embedded in this experience. The most important realization was that integrity isn't just about personal character. It's about creating systems that reward honesty and punish deception, regardless of who's involved. Richard had succeeded in his manipulation for as long as he did because Meridian's culture had enabled his behavior. Board members who should have asked harder questions, HR systems that prioritized loyalty over accountability, and performance metrics that could be easily manipulated to support predetermined conclusions. Fixing these structural problems would be essential to preventing similar crises in the future. The next morning brought a steady stream of calls from colleagues, clients, and industry contacts who'd heard about Richard's dramatic downfall. The financial services community was smaller than most people realized, and news traveled fast when a CEO was terminated for fraud. Most callers expressed support and congratulations, but I could detect underlying questions about Meridian's stability and future direction. Elizabeth called around 10 a.m., her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd seen justice properly served. "Marcus, I hope you slept well last night. You certainly earned it after yesterday's ordeal." "I did, thank you, though I have to admit, the magnitude of what we're facing is starting to sink in. Rebuilding trust won't happen overnight." "No, it won't," she agreed. "But you have something Richard never possessed, the respect of people who actually matter in this industry. Your clients trust you, your colleagues respect your judgment, and now the board has given you authority to make meaningful changes." She was right about the respect, and I was already seeing evidence of it. 3 major clients had called that morning specifically to express confidence in my leadership and confirm their intention to maintain their relationships with Meridian. Word was spreading that ethical leadership had prevailed over corporate politics, and people were responding positively to that message. My first official act as Chief Investment Officer was scheduling individual meetings with every portfolio manager in the division. I wanted to hear their perspectives on what had gone wrong, their ideas for improvement, and their concerns about the future. These conversations would be crucial for understanding the full extent of Richard's impact and identifying the changes needed to move forward. The meetings proved even more revealing than I'd expected. Junior managers described a culture of fear, where questioning Richard's decisions was seen as career suicide. Senior managers admitted they'd known about irregularities, but hadn't felt safe reporting them through normal channels. Most concerning, several people mentioned other instances of account manipulation that hadn't been discovered during the initial investigation. Jennifer Walsh from HR was among the most difficult conversations. She'd clearly been complicit in Richard's scheme, helping to create the documentation that had nearly destroyed my career. But rather than firing her immediately, I decided to use her knowledge of his methods to ensure we'd identified all the problems. "Jennifer, I'm going to be direct with you," I said during our meeting. "You participated in a systematic effort to falsify performance data and manipulate client accounts. That's grounds for immediate termination and potential criminal charges." Her face went pale, but she nodded without trying to deny the obvious. "I know. I've been expecting this conversation since yesterday. However," I continued, "I'm more interested in fixing the problems than punishing everyone who was involved. I need to know about every instance of data manipulation, every falsified report, every account that was accessed without proper authorization. Complete honesty might be your only chance to salvage your career here." The information she provided over the following days was staggering. Richard's manipulation had been far more extensive than even Elizabeth's investigation had revealed. He'd been altering performance reports for nearly 2 years, creating fake client complaints to justify removing managers who questioned his decisions, and using his administrative access to execute unauthorized trades across multiple accounts. Most disturbing were the emails she'd preserved, communications where Richard explicitly discussed framing me for misconduct as a way to eliminate opposition to his investment strategies. The premeditation was chilling, demonstrating a level of calculated malice that went far beyond simple corporate politics. Armed with this evidence, I worked with legal counsel to notify every affected client and begin the process of correcting the financial harm caused by Richard's unauthorized trading. Several clients were entitled to significant compensation for losses incurred through his manipulation, and Meridian would need to absorb those costs while implementing new safeguards to prevent future incidents. The regulatory investigation launched the following week, with federal investigators examining every aspect of Richard's tenure as CEO. The Securities and Exchange Commission was particularly interested in the systematic nature of his fraud and the apparent failure of internal controls that should have detected his activities much earlier. But amid all the investigations and remedial work, something remarkable was happening to Meridian's culture. Employees who'd been afraid to speak up for months were suddenly contributing ideas and raising concerns they'd previously kept to themselves. The atmosphere of fear and conformity was being replaced by genuine collaboration and shared accountability. Margaret Winters, who'd emerged as an unlikely ally during the board meeting, became my closest partner in implementing new governance procedures. Her risk management expertise proved invaluable in designing systems that would flag suspicious activity before it could cause significant harm. "Marcus, what impresses me most about your approach is the emphasis on prevention rather than punishment," she observed during one of our planning sessions. Most executives would be focused on making examples of people who collaborated with Richard. "Making examples doesn't solve systemic problems," I replied. "The goal is creating an environment where ethical behavior is rewarded and misconduct is impossible to hide. That requires changing incentives, not just changing personnel." 3 months after Richard's termination, Meridian's transformation was becoming visible to the broader financial community. Our client retention rate had actually improved as word spread about the new leadership's commitment to transparency and ethical practices. Several major institutional investors who'd been considering other firms decided to move their accounts to Meridian, specifically because of our reputation for integrity. The turnaround wasn't just about external perceptions. It was reflected in measurable performance improvements across the board. Portfolio managers who'd been afraid to take calculated risks under Richard's micromanagement were now producing innovative strategies that balanced growth potential with client safety. Our compliance department reported 0 regulatory violations for the first time in 18 months. Most gratifying were the individual success stories emerging throughout the organization. Junior analysts who'd been overlooked or marginalized were suddenly being recognized for their contributions. Senior managers who'd been considering leaving the firm were re-engaging with renewed enthusiasm. The culture of merit and mutual respect I'd always believed in was finally becoming reality. Elizabeth remained my most trusted advisor throughout. This transition, offering insights gained from decades of building and leading successful organizations. During one of our quarterly reviews, she made an observation that crystallized everything I'd learned from this experience. Marcus, the difference between you and Richard isn't just about ethics. It's about understanding what actually creates lasting success. He focused on short-term appearances and political maneuvering, while you've always prioritized long-term relationships and sustainable results. That's why his approach was doomed to fail eventually. Her words reminded me of a conversation I'd had with my father years earlier when I was first starting my career in financial services. He'd worked as a bank manager for 30 years, and his advice had shaped my entire professional philosophy. "Son," he'd said, "in this business, your reputation is your most valuable asset. It takes decades to build and can be destroyed in minutes. Never do anything that compromises your integrity, because once people stop trusting you, nothing else matters." I'd carried those words with me through every decision, every client interaction, every moment when expedience seemed more attractive than principle. They'd guided me through the darkest period of my career, when it seemed like integrity was a liability rather than an asset. The vindication felt complete when industry publications began recognizing Meridian's transformation. Financial Planning magazine featured our governance reforms in a cover story about rebuilding trust after corporate scandals. The Journal of Portfolio Management published an article I'd written about ethical investment practices and their impact on long-term performance. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 6 months after Richard's termination, I received a handwritten letter from his replacement at his new firm, a small investment company that had hired him despite his tarnished reputation. "Mr. Rivera," the letter read, "I wanted you to know that Richard Blackwood's employment here has been terminated due to irregularities in client account management. Your testimony during the regulatory investigation helped us understand the pattern of behavior we were seeing. Thank you for your commitment to protecting client interests, even when it cost you personally." The letter confirmed what I'd always believed, that ethical principles weren't just personally fulfilling, they were professionally essential. Richard's pattern of manipulation had continued at his new firm, ultimately destroying his career entirely. Meanwhile, the reputation for integrity I'd protected had become the foundation for unprecedented success and influence. As I reflected on this journey during Meridian's annual client appreciation event, surrounded by colleagues who'd become genuine partners and clients who'd become trusted friends, I realized that survival hadn't been the real victory. The real victory was proving that ethical leadership could transform an entire organization and create lasting value for everyone involved. Standing at the podium to address our gathered clients, I looked out at faces that represented families, businesses, and institutions whose financial security we'd been entrusted to protect. Elizabeth sat in the front row, her smile reflecting the pride of someone who'd bet on integrity and watched it pay dividends far beyond what anyone had imagined. "A year ago," I began, This firm faced a crisis that could have destroyed everything we'd built over decades. We discovered that some of our leadership had lost sight of the fundamental principles that make financial services a noble profession: the obligation to put client welfare above personal advancement, to tell the truth even when it's inconvenient, and to build relationships based on trust rather than manipulation. I paused, thinking about that morning in the boardroom when everything had seemed lost. But we also discovered something equally important: that ethical principles aren't just moral luxuries we can afford when times are good. They're practical necessities that determine whether an organization survives and thrives over the long term. The applause that followed felt different from the polite recognition typical of such events. It carried the weight of shared experience, the satisfaction of people who'd witnessed justice prevail over deception and chosen to be part of something better. Later that evening, as Sarah and I walked through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, she asked a question that had been on both our minds for months. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Elizabeth hadn't walked into that boardroom when she did? I considered the question seriously. Sometimes. But I've come to believe that the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Maybe not as dramatically as it did that day, but somehow, somewhere, Richard's lies would have been exposed. You really believe that? I have to, I replied. Because if I didn't believe that integrity ultimately wins over deception, I couldn't do this job with the confidence our clients deserve. As we reached our front door, I realized that this experience had fundamentally changed not just my career, but my understanding of what it means to lead with purpose. The fear and uncertainty I'd felt during those dark weeks had been replaced by something far more powerful: the knowledge that standing up for what's right, even when it seems impossible, can create opportunities to build something better than what existed before. The teenage version of myself who'd first dreamed of working in financial services could never have imagined this outcome. But perhaps that's the point. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from achieving what we planned, but from discovering what becomes possible when we refuse to compromise our principles, even when the whole world seems to be against us. The morning sun streaming through our kitchen window as I prepared for another day at Meridian felt like a daily reminder of that truth. Every challenge we'd overcome, every relationship we'd rebuilt, every innovation we'd implemented, all of it had grown from the decision to stand firm when standing firm seemed foolish. And as I drove to work, knowing that hundreds of families trusted me with their financial futures, I carried with me the most important lesson of all: that real leadership isn't about avoiding failure. It's about transforming failure into the foundation for unprecedented success. That transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen alone. It requires people like Elizabeth, who refuse to accept injustice even when it would be easier to look the other way. It requires colleagues like Margaret, who choose principle over politics when it matters most. And it requires the kind of faith in human nature that believes truth will ultimately prevail over deception, even when all evidence suggests otherwise. The story that began with betrayal had become a testament to the power of integrity, the importance of courage, and the possibility that even our darkest moments can become the catalyst for our greatest achievements. That, I realized, was worth every moment of fear, every sleepless night, and every doubt I'd experienced along the way. Because sometimes the price of standing up for what's right isn't just worth paying. It's the investment that makes everything else possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. He'd call at 6 p.m. to say he was handling a client emergency and wouldn't be home until 9 or 10. He'd leave for the office earlier in the mornings, claiming he needed quiet time to focus on strategic planning. Our evening conversations about business became shorter and less detailed. He'd give me summary updates rather than asking for my input on specific decisions. I told myself this was natural. The business was growing, and growth requires more hands-on management. Marcus was probably feeling the pressure of increased responsibility and trying to handle more things independently. I respected his need for space and focused on my own projects. I didn't realize that what I was interpreting as professional growth was actually emotional distance. 2 months ago, Marcus hired a new assistant. Her name is Jessica Walsh, and she's 26 years old with a marketing degree from Virginia Commonwealth University. She's smart, organized, and ambitious. Exactly the kind of person a growing consultancy needs to handle operations and client coordination. Marcus spoke about her with genuine enthusiasm, praising her strategic thinking and her ability to manage complex projects. At first, I was relieved that Marcus had found someone capable to help with the administrative work that had been overwhelming him. Jessica seemed to understand the business quickly and was able to take over tasks that had been consuming too much of Marcus's time. He started coming home less stressed, more focused, and more optimistic about the company's direction. But I also noticed other changes. Marcus started paying more attention to his appearance, buying new clothes and spending more time at the gym. He upgraded his office furniture and invested in expensive artwork for the conference room. He began hosting client meetings that ran later into the evening, often with Jessica staying to help coordinate follow-up work. When I asked about Jessica, Marcus would speak about her professionally, but with an energy that seemed different from how he talked about other employees. He'd mention her ideas, her insights, her ability to anticipate what clients needed. He'd describe her as being naturally gifted at relationship management and strategic thinking. There was admiration in his voice that went beyond typical workplace appreciation. 3 weeks ago, I had to travel to Denver for a real estate investment conference. It was a 4-day trip, and I'd been looking forward to it for months. The conference was featuring several speakers I'd wanted to hear, and I had meetings scheduled with potential partners for a major commercial development project. Marcus seemed supportive of the trip, encouraging me to take time to network and explore new opportunities. The morning I left, Marcus kissed me goodbye and said he was excited for me to pursue my own interests more actively. He said it would be good for both of us to have some independence, to remember who we were as individuals rather than just as a couple. At the time, I thought it was sweet. He was giving me permission to prioritize my career development without feeling guilty. About being away from home, the conference was incredible. I attended presentations about emerging markets, participated in discussions about sustainable development, and had conversations that opened up possibilities for investments I'd never considered. I felt energized and intellectually stimulated in ways I hadn't experienced in years. For 4 days, I was Victoria Chen, the investor and strategist, not just Marcus's wife and business partner. On the last day of the conference, I decided to fly home a day early. I'd accomplished everything I needed to do, and I was excited to surprise Marcus with what I'd learned. I thought we could spend the evening talking about new opportunities and planning how to integrate some of the conference insights into our existing businesses. I took a cab directly from the airport to the Meridian building. It was Thursday afternoon around 2:30 p.m., and I knew Marcus would be in his office working on client proposals. I'd brought lunch from his favorite restaurant in Denver, a small gesture to show I'd been thinking about him during the trip. The elevator ride to the 8th floor felt longer than usual. I was rehearsing how I'd surprise him, imagining his reaction when I walked through the door with lunch and stories about the conference. I was looking forward to seeing his face light up, to sharing my excitement about the new possibilities I'd discovered. I walked through the reception area of Chen & Associates, past Jessica's desk, which was empty. The office was quiet, which wasn't unusual for a Thursday afternoon. Most of the staff worked flexible schedules, and Marcus often preferred having the office to himself for focused work sessions. I approached Marcus's office door, which was slightly open. I could hear voices inside, Marcus talking to someone in the low, intimate tone he usually reserved for our private conversations at home. I assumed he was on a phone call with an important client, and was about to knock when I heard Jessica's laugh. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Marcus and Jessica were standing behind his desk, her arms around his neck, his hands on her waist. They were kissing with the kind of intensity that suggested this wasn't their first time. When they heard the door, they broke apart, but neither of them stepped away from the other. For a moment, none of us spoke. I stood there holding a bag of takeout food, looking at my husband of 8 years embracing a woman who was young enough to be his younger sister. Jessica's lipstick was smeared, and Marcus's hair was disheveled. They'd clearly been doing more than discussing quarterly projections. Marcus looked directly at me, and instead of apologizing or explaining, he said, "This is why I never loved you. You're always checking up on me." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not just the admission about not loving me, but the accusation that I was somehow at fault for discovering his affair. As if my early return from a business trip was an invasion of his privacy rather than an attempt to surprise him with lunch. Jessica stepped back, her face flushed with embarrassment, but Marcus didn't move. He stood there, straightened his shirt, and continued talking as if I was an unwelcome interruption to his afternoon. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you this," he said. "Jessica and I have been seeing each other for 2 months. We're in love, and I want a divorce." I looked at Jessica, who was staring at the floor, unable to make eye contact. Then I looked back at Marcus, who was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not guilt or remorse, but irritation. He was annoyed that I'd complicated his afternoon by showing up unannounced. "I see," I said, setting the bag of food on his desk. "I brought you lunch." Marcus glanced at the bag dismissively. "You can't just show up here whenever you want, Victoria. This is my office, my business. You don't work here." I almost laughed. The irony was so perfect it felt like a scene from a movie. My husband was telling me I didn't belong in a building I owned, in an office I was paying for, in a business I'd funded and structured. He was asserting ownership over assets that were legally mine while standing next to a woman he was cheating with. But instead of explaining any of this, I just nodded. "You're right," I said. "I don't work here." I turned around and walked out of the office, leaving the lunch on his desk. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, walked to my car, and sat there for 10 minutes trying to process what had just happened. My marriage was over, that much was clear. But everything else, the business, the building, the careful financial structures I'd built over more than a decade, that was about to become much more complicated. As I drove home, I realized that Marcus had just made the biggest strategic error of his professional life. He'd assumed that because I worked quietly, I was powerless. He'd mistaken my preference for privacy for weakness. He'd confused my willingness to let him take credit with actual ownership. He was about to learn the difference between being the face of a business and actually controlling it, and I was about to discover just how much strength I'd been hiding from myself all these years. I drove home in complete silence, my hands steady on the steering wheel even though my entire world had just shifted beneath me. The strangest part wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the crystal-clear thinking that had taken over my mind. While most people might have been consumed by rage or heartbreak, I found myself automatically cataloging assets, reviewing legal documents in my memory, and calculating the financial implications of what I'd just witnessed. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had already made 3 crucial decisions. First, I would not confront Marcus emotionally or give him the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. Second, I would use this weekend to quietly secure every asset and legal document that mattered.